Welcome to CharityVillage Connects. I'm Mary Barrell. Over many years, the leadership of the Canadian nonprofit sector has been criticized for its lack of diversity. As recently as 2019, the Senate of Canada published Catalyst for Change, a roadmap to a stronger charitable sector. Among its recommendations was a proposed change to amend the Income Tax Act to require charities to report on board diversity when they file their annual T3010s. Senator Ratna Omidvar has since proposed Bill S-279 to do just that. Recently, the Diversity Institute, in partnership with Civic Action, has released an important report entitled Diversity and Inclusion in Nonprofit Leadership in Ontario. Are we there yet? Joining us today to discuss the findings of the report, the proposed bill, and the current state of equity and diversity in Canada's nonprofit leadership is Dr. Wendy Cukier, the founder and academic director of the Diversity Institute at the Toronto Metropolitan University. Based in the Ted Rogers School of Management, Wendy is also a professor of entrepreneurship and innovation with a PhD in information systems. An award-winning diversity leader and best-selling author, Wendy leads the Women Entrepreneurship Knowledge Hub and is the academic research director for the Future Skills Centre. As an ecosystem partner with Canada's 50/30 Challenge, the Diversity Institute also develops tools to promote inclusive work environments and reduce barriers for equity-deserving groups. Welcome back to the podcast, Wendy.
Thanks for having me, Mary. Lovely to be here again.
Well, I'd love to hear more about your new report on diversity and inclusion in nonprofit leadership in Ontario. What made you decide to do this important research right now? And tell us about the impact it has on the sector and why it's important.
Well, I think it was really Civic Action that led the way on this. And I think it was in part because the programs that they have to advance underrepresented groups, equity deserving groups in leadership roles. They have a number of programs that are aimed at getting more diverse people on boards, and they realized that there were real gaps in the data, and there are gaps in the data because there is no mandatory reporting. So they asked us to do the project, and we were really pleased to be able to participate, especially because of the work we're doing and you're helping with respect to the 50/30 challenge. And I think there's a lot of attention being focused right now on diversity in governance and diversity in leadership. And, what I would say is there's good news and there's not so good news that came out of the research.
Well, can you share with us some of the high-level findings that the sector should be aware of?
Well, I think it's no secret that there's been a lot of emphasis in recent years on improving representation on boards. And women have long been overrepresented in the nonprofit sector. There are a higher percentage of volunteers, higher percentage of workers, higher percentage of fundraisers, higher percentage of board members. And in fact, in leadership roles, you see women much better represented in nonprofit organizations and in CEO and VP roles than you would see, for example, in the private sector. And what's really exciting to me, because we've been tracking representation in the nonprofit sector since about 2008. And what's really encouraging as well is to see that boards are also becoming less homogeneous. So we're seeing, for example, racialized people are getting close to the same level of representation as in the population. In fact, in some communities, there's overrepresentation of people who are racialized. We're seeing Indigenous people still underrepresented, but again, those numbers are growing. We're seeing persons with disabilities still pretty underrepresented, and some of that may be associated with disclosure issues, right? Because if people don't feel welcome, they often don't disclose that they have disabilities. And we're also seeing newcomers and immigrants better represented than I think we have in the past. People who identify as 2S LGBTQ plus tend to be reasonably well represented. So when we look at boards, it's a good story. When we look at executives, not so good. Women, again, have a reasonably high level of participation as executives. They're about 34%, 38%, sorry, but it's predominantly white women. And so when we look at the senior leadership in the organizations, we still see very, very white people dominate. We see much less representation of racialized people, Indigenous people, and so on in those executive type roles. And of course, the other issue that keeps coming up is the experiences of women, racialized people, and others in these organizations. And we know there's still barriers there.
The report extensively explores the experiences of leaders in the sector. Why was this important, and what did you discover? And how did you actually approach the intersectionality in your research?
Well, it's a really good question because we have known, and this has been a recurrent theme. We've known that even though women dominate the sector, their experiences are not always positive, and the experiences of things like sexual harassment, especially for women who are in fundraising roles, and of course, in many nonprofits, those are core roles. Executives spend a lot of time with potential donors and so on. The experiences of sexual harassment are quite pervasive. We know that when it comes to racialized peoples and Indigenous people and others, there's also evidence that they don't necessarily feel welcome. They don't necessarily feel that they have the same opportunities as others. And when we start to look at intersectionality, the combination of some of those things, when we look at racialized women, Indigenous women, and so on, we see the experiences are fairly uneven, and often it's not clear whether experiences are being shaped by gender issues or whether it's issues around race. But we talk a lot about the idea that diversity is being invited to the table and inclusion is being asked to dance. And I think what the research shows is we're definitely moving forward when it comes to diversity, but we have a longer way to go to hit inclusion where everyone feels valued and can bring their whole self to work.
I wonder if there are any findings that you found surprising. Did anything come up in the research that was unexpected?
Well, I have to say that, we started doing this research actually with Senator Ahmedvar when she was with the Maitrey Foundation and Civic Action in 2008. That was the first time we looked at gender as well as race in on boards and in leadership roles, and it was not a very pretty picture. So fast forward to today, we've definitely seen transformation of boards, and it only makes sense because as the population is changing, the people you're serving are changing, the people whose pockets you want to dip into are changing. And so it makes sense that boards in particular are moving forward quickly because it's often easier to change boards. But when it comes to the executive level, women have made lots of progress, but other groups not so much. So I think I was pleasantly surprised at the progress that we've seen on boards, and not entirely surprised that we've seen less progress at the executive level. The other thing, of course, that's important is there's huge variation in the size and sophistication of nonprofits and charities, as you would know. And again, the bigger, the more established the organization, the less likely you are to see women and diverse people in the senior roles. So because this was a very large sample, it wasn't just looking at the biggest nonprofits or the biggest foundations or the biggest charities. I think it may paint a more optimistic picture than if we looked at the largest and whether you're talking about dollar value or whether you're talking about size in terms of people. I think we see Indigenous peoples, racialized people, and others making more progress. I think in some of the smaller organizations because it's harder to get volunteers these days than it was, even 10, 15 years ago because of the aging population. I think the other thing that came up, which when I thought about it wasn't surprising, as one of the boomers, last people standing, is people talking about experiencing ageism, and particularly women. Feeling that rather than being valued for their wisdom and respected as elders, feeling that they were being sort of pushed aside. So that was also a rather interesting finding.
Hmm. Well, I wonder if there were key differences in the different demographic groups that you surveyed, since you're talking now about ageism in the in terms of the experience that some of the individuals you dealt with described. But in terms of their experiences and their representation in leadership, um, what did you see in that demographic piece of the puzzle?
Well, again, when we look at leaders as opposed to board members, the picture is quite a bit different. And so we see that, for example, if you look at board chair, executive director, or CEO, 58% are white men and 34% are white women. And so you do the math, it doesn't leave a lot of space for racialized men or racialized women. So there is a big difference, I would say, between the boards and the senior leadership. That being said, we know that as boards become more diverse, because one of their big responsibilities is hiring the CEO, often you will see more diversity in boards first, and then diversity in senior leaders follows, as diverse boards are going to perhaps place more priority on hiring diverse leaders.
Very interesting. So the report splits its recommendations into three sections: societal, organizational, and individual. Can you explain why you took this approach? What are some of the recommendations coming out of this report and its findings as it relates to those sections?
Well, there are no simple solutions to complex problems. And one of the things I find um, most I was going to say amusing, but that's maybe not actually the word, is very often people gravitate to education, right? So, how are we going to address diversity and inclusion in our organization? Everyone's going to do unconscious bias training, or everyone's going to get EDI training. Training is the least effective way of changing behavior. It's often a necessary condition because you have to change minds and hearts, but I know if I eat too much and I don't exercise, I get fat. Has no impact on my behavior. And that tendency to gravitate towards training rather than really thinking more strategically about what needs to happen in order to create change is really important. And so a lot of the work that we do is grounded in public health models, to tell you the truth, because I really like public health as a discipline because it's rigorous from a scientific perspective, but it also puts a lot of emphasis on behavioral change. So unlike other disciplines where they study things, public health studies things and then tries to change behavior, whether it's, getting people not to smoke, getting, fighting obesity, getting people to get vaccinations or whatever. And so it's very much grounded in change, in looking at how you drive change. And one of the big things that we know out of the research is these are complex systems. there are, if you think about the barriers to women, to racialized people, to others in terms of leadership, there are lots of things that get in the way. I mean, stereotypes, culture, notions of leadership. Those are really high level kinds of, of factors that have a big impact. On the other hand, if we look at levers that have driven change in the nonprofit sector, in the for-profit sector, we just did a couple of studies on this. Legislation definitely makes a difference. You know, the employment equity legislation applied to federally regulated companies, banks, transportation, communications, they're ahead of the curve in terms of representation, because since 1986, they've had to report on representation, and what gets measured gets done. So legislation is really powerful. We also know that voluntary codes help drive change because they shape norms. And so research that we've done recently shows, for instance, that companies that are part of the 30% club, which is where they've committed to 30% representation on their boards and in leadership of women, companies that have signed on to the Black North Initiative, and we hope companies that sign on to the 50-30 Challenge will actually demonstrate those commitments more than organizations that haven't signed on to those codes. And it's peer pressure. It's you know, what gets measured gets done, and staking the turf. And so if we think about that, then the societal level factors we need to consider in the nonprofit sector, similarly, are voluntary codes, are norms, are stereotypes, and so on. So that's why the societal level matters. And even things like, you know, access to childcare. There's a reason why Quebec has more women leaders, has more women entrepreneurs, has a smaller wage gap than the rest of Canada. It's because they've had affordable childcare for a very long time. You know, immigration policy, credential recognition. There are lots and lots of policies that have an impact on opportunities. So we have to look at those issues. Then you have to look at organizations themselves and their strategies, whether they have set targets, what kind of processes they have for recruiting and selecting board members and leaders, what kind of HR policies they have, how they design their programs and services to ensure that they meet the needs of increasingly diverse organizations, and so on and so forth. And then, of course, at the end of the day, there are individual factors and, you know, the choices that we make as individuals, how hard we try to create more opportunities for people who are not like us. Those things become very important. And the reality is, in the nonprofit sector, even though lots of people are in the sector because of their commitments to social justice, and many of the leaders are values driven, and so are the organizations, one of the biggest levers is money. And if you've got donors, if you've got government funders, if you've got volunteers who care deeply about issues around representation, diversity, and inclusion, there's a really strong case for taking this stuff seriously. And we are seeing more and more government asking questions, not setting quotas, but asking questions. What is your representation? Have you signed on to 50-30? The United Way of Greater Toronto asked that question of organizations that it's going to potentially fund. So those sorts of things can really have an impact on the broader context in which we all work, and I think that's helping to move us forward.
That's fascinating. Since you mentioned it, how does the 50-30 challenge work as a tool for organizations who want to create change in this area?
So it's a really good question. 50-30 challenge is a voluntary code. It's also aspirational. So 50 refers to gender parity. 30 refers to increased diversity, and that can be diversity in terms of racialized people, people who are Black, Indigenous peoples, persons with disabilities, or those who identify as 2S LGBTQ+. And what I love about the 50/30 challenge is it's adaptable to the environment. So if you're in Toronto, racialization, big issue. Black community, big issue. But if you're in Winnipeg, the focus may be more on Indigenous peoples. And so it allows organizations to set targets based on the context that they're in. You know, in Toronto, half the population's racialized. In St. John's, Newfoundland, I think it's less than 10%. So it wouldn't make sense to have the same targets in both places. So it allows you a lot of flexibility, and it applies to boards and or senior executives. Organizations, some organizations may already meet it. So if you have a board of 10 people and there are 5 women and 2 women are racialized and 1 is Indigenous, you're 50/30, okay? Which is great. But even if you're not and you aspire to gender parity and increased diversity, and you're prepared to put a stake in the ground and say, you know, by 2030, we'll hit 50/30, you can sign up as well. And what that gives you is access to lots of resources and supports that are free and tools to help you move forward. And as I said, we are seeing funders, governments, municipalities, provinces, and federal government starting to ask more questions about your equity, diversity, and inclusion strategies, about representation, about how you translate your good intentions into actions. And so I would argue it helps organizations sort of move in that direction and potentially provides access to opportunities they wouldn't otherwise have.
So how can organizations get involved with the 50/30 challenge? Just on a nuts and bolts kind of question. You've mentioned the resources that are available. Are these available for organizations who aren't yet ready to formally start the challenge? Or like, what advice would you give to organizations that are interested in exploring the 50/30 challenge?
Well, you can get, I mean, there are a number of partners, the UN Global Compact, a number of different organizations, as well as the Diversity Institute, have resources to help move forward. KPMG developed a toolkit. There's a website on the government website as well. So you can read about it. You can find out more information. You can come to one of the webinars. And then if you decide it's something you want to do, it's very easy to sign up. Mary, as you know, we're also looking at formal certification. And we know that to some organizations that's going to be really important. So we've been working with the Standards Council of Canada to explore what formal certification might potentially look like. But it's not a heavy lift. Most boards would require resolution of the board to make such a commitment. But as I said, it's aspirational. So you don't sign up because you necessarily have achieved the 50/30 targets. You sign up because you intend to move in that direction. And it's very similar to the Black North Initiative or the 30% Club. So really encourage people to do that. And of course, they can reach out to you or I and get more information.
Well, we mentioned off the top of this discussion that Senator Ratna Omidvar's Bill S-279 would create a question on the T3010 to measure the diversity of charitable boards. Do you think a step like this is important for the sector? What are your thoughts around that? I know you believe what can't be measured can't be achieved.
Well, it's interesting because Bill C-25, which applies to federally regulated distributing corporations, when that was before Parliament, Senator Omidvar was pushing to try to get it applied more broadly, not just to federally regulated distributing private sector corporations. So this is something she's been working on for several years. And when you think about it, it is a little weird to me that large corporations have to report on this, and organizations in the charitable sector, often who receive, if not direct government funding, significant benefits from, tax relief and so on. To me, it's a bit weird that charities and nonprofits have not been subject to some kind of reporting. I work at a university. The bank has more reporting requirements than the university because the university is provincially regulated. And I personally think that organizations in the public sector, universities, hospitals, charities, and nonprofits generally, because they do receive benefits as a result of their status, should be held to a higher standard than private sector corporations. And I also think it's as the population is changing, whether you're a professional association, whether you're a service delivery organization, whether you're a hospital or university, you have to be able to meet the needs of increasingly diverse communities. And so, this is to me part of that process. It's not the only thing. As many people point out, representation alone does not create inclusive work environments. Just because you have a woman as president does not mean um, it's all flowers and unicorns. But there is no question that boards that have more women represented, have more Indigenous peoples represented in particular, are more likely to drive inclusive organizations, are more likely to see things that, boards that are less homogeneous or more homogeneous may not see in terms of opportunities. And, I've told this story before, Mary, but I was on a board once and I was pushing for more diversity. It was a board in the city of Toronto where half the population's racialized. And one of the other board members, I was a bit of a troublemaker, one of the other board members looked at me and said, well, Wendy, I'm not a racist, but we need people with money and connections, as if only white people had money and connections. And so it's, to me, it's just a missed opportunity if people are not taking this more seriously.
So overall, given all the work you've done with the 50-30 challenge, the work you've done with Senator Omidvar and this bill that is, you know, may well become law, um, overall, and the report that you've just worked on and the results that showed you some surprising kinds of data, overall, are you optimistic that we'll see a real shift in the years to come in terms of diversity and inclusion at the leadership level in the nonprofit sector?
Um, you know, it's glass half empty, glass half full. So I would say in general, I am more optimistic. But Mary, there have been some pretty horrifying examples of backlash. We are seeing, and apologies, I'm sure lots of people don't agree with me, but we are seeing a shift in public opinion around, for example, newcomers. And remember, a high percentage of newcomers are racialized, as opposed to, when my father immigrated to Canada. We are seeing, in my view, a level of xenophobia and racism that we haven't seen before for 20 years. For the first time in a long time, there are as many people in Canada almost saying we have too many immigrants as they're saying we don't have too many immigrants. And that's a huge shift. And I think it's also, frankly, wrong because we know as the boomers are retiring, there are huge, huge shoes to fill. And it's not just because I got big feet. It's because there are a lot of us exiting the market. I was at the St. Catharines Volunteer of the Year awards Tuesday night. That we give out an award to the Youth Volunteer of the Year in the name of my parents. Most of the people in that room were my vintage or older. And if we don't find a way to engage young people and diverse communities, we are going to be in a lot of trouble. And I'm sure many of the people on the call notice this with their traditional donors aging out or even dying off. We've got to revitalize the sector. And in my mind, diversity and inclusion is a really important way to do it. But I am very concerned about some of the signs that we're seeing, even in Canada. We're not immune to what we see south of the border, and stuff that's going on in the States is just plain horrifying. So, I do think that this should not be a partisan issue. I do think that this is an economic issue. It's a question of our identity as Canadians. And I think that we have to kind of lock arms, regardless of what our opinions are and all sorts of other things, and fight tooth and nail against some of the evidence of backlash that we're starting to see. The good news is there are lots of leaders who are on all sides of the political spectrum that are just saying, we're staying the course. But I quite honestly do worry about some of what we're hearing and the extent to which people are blaming immigrants for things that make no sense at all. And we've got lots of economists saying, the housing crisis cannot be blamed on immigrants. It's a supply issue as much as it's a demand issue. So those are the things that make me less optimistic, but certainly the trends make me hopeful.
Well, I couldn't agree with you more on that last point, and I'll lock arms with you, Wendy. Thank you for your insights into your important and timely report on the diversity of Canadian nonprofit leadership. Your expertise and perspectives are so valuable to the nonprofit leaders as they pursue their own EDI journeys for their organizations. Thank you for joining us on Charity Village Connects.
Thanks for having me.